And so good morning officially for the recording and to our everyone who's joining us today. My name is Sam Bowers. I'm the consultant for continuing education at the State Library of Iowa. I am joined today by Becky Heil, also of the State Library, and a number of excellent panelists who are here to share about disaster planning and disaster response in their libraries. So Becky, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Good morning and welcome to everybody. My name is Becky Heil and I am the consultant for the State Library of Iowa in the Southeast District. And I've been told that I am to blame for this fall series on disaster preparation. I started talking about disaster plans as the pandemic was really kind of ramping up, and I didn't shut up about it. So they finally decided, let's just do it for learning circuits this year and we can get her to stop talking about this. Let's see here. You might remember that our continuing ed theme this year, starting last January, was all about make room for yes. I really wanted all of you guys to make room to plan for the future. I really feel like disaster plans fall to the bottom of the to-do list. So I really wanted to help everybody focus on getting a plan into place. So I asked each of our presenters today to join us kind of for a specific reason. Some people dealt with floods, some people dealt with derechos or their aftermath. We have people who dealt with forest fires, hurricanes, and more. So you might be saying to yourself, Becky, we don't have forest fires or hurricanes in Iowa. So what I really wanted them to talk to you about was their plan and then have them give us their perspective on how having that plan in place or not having a plan in place really contributed to the speed and success of that recovery process. So I have to thank Sam for the title of this. It's Not Going According to Plan, and the discussion on disaster planning. It really captured what I was trying to get across with this. So again, as Sam mentioned, just a quick agenda. We're going to start today with sort of this brief introduction here that I've got going. Then we're going to move right into our panelists. We've got 6 people on the docket today, and I know you're going to get a lot from each of them. So I will let each of them do their own introductions, and then they've got about 10 to 12 minutes to sort of share their experiences. For those of you who have attended any of the other sessions that we've done, you've probably seen this cycle before. This was introduced in our in-person learning circuits that we did back, I think it was in October last month. Seems like more than a month ago, I guess, because we're at the end of November. But I think really at this point, we're kind of in that preparedness cycle. And what we really use this to talk about is it's never just over. We don't write that plan and then never have to look at it again. It really is part of that cycle. And so we've got to go through, getting prepared. How do we respond to it? How are we covering? And then we start thinking about prevention. And really that's part of what this plan is going to help us with as well. So now I've asked Sam to spend just a second to talk about this toolkit that was put together. It was introduced at those in-person learning circuits, and you can see the QR code on the screen. That will take you to a Google Drive where Sam's got a whole bunch of documents that you can use to put together your plan. So Sam, do you want to talk real quick about that?
Yeah, actually, I should double check that link because it shouldn't take you to Google Drive, but a page on the State Library website. And I'll drop the full link in the chat as well if folks want to click on it. But we put this together because we were collecting, we put a lot of work into collating resources for you guys on this topic. And I really wanted a centralized location to stash them all, including the recordings from events like today's and other follow-up activities. But you can access that. I put the link in the chat or here on the State Library website. The big resource that's there that I want to point out to folks is a disaster response plan template. So you can take that template, it's about 11 or 12 pages, and work your way down right through everything from emergency contacts to suppliers to disaster response team. We also have some supporting videos that go along with that as you're filling out the plan that gives some kind of background information. But that plan really is there for you guys to take and use. We tried to kind of find a middle ground between, some disaster templates you find online are hundreds and hundreds of pages long. Others of them just say something like, call the director and let her figure it out, which is also perhaps not terribly helpful. So we wanted to give it a little bit of bones to support you guys, but also not be super overwhelming, because we know that for many of our smaller libraries, realistically, recovery is going to look a lot different than in a larger setting. So we tried to find a happy medium there, but you'll find those resources all on that website.
Thank you. And normally we would save this sort of other webinars that are coming till the end, but since we're doing this screen share and we've got so many presenters, I really wanted to just bring this up now. Obviously today is the November 29th Disaster Response Panel. We've got a series for our boardroom coming up that will be talking about disaster plans and what the board's relationship is with that disaster plan. We've got another one coming in early December to talk a little bit about supporting yourself, your staff, and your community, and that whole idea of wellness in the community, and how do we recover personally after a disaster rips through a community. And then there's a really nice one coming up at the very right before Christmas, Collection Salvage 101, that I think is going to be a really good one as well. So with all of those introductions, here are the presenters that we'll be having today. Let me find my notes here. I really would like to say thanks to each of them for taking time out of their busy day to join us. They all have, like I said, a different perspective on this, and I'm really excited to hear all of the stories. First up, I'm going to have Jillian talk a little bit about the plan that was put in place in Bettendorf for COVID and the pandemic. I kind of watched Bettendorf as we were sort of moving through this, and I liked the little bits and pieces of their plan that I saw. I thought it was really well done. So I asked Jillian to talk a little bit about that. Each of the rest of them have, like I said, another way to kind of look at that plan and how it worked. And I'd especially like to thank Darryl this morning because of communication errors on Becky's part. He basically joined us this morning at the very last minute. So I appreciate that. So Darryl, you're up last. Jillian, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so you can get yours up and ready to go. And like I said, I'm delighted everybody is here today.
Yeah, I will also, while Jillian's getting her slides set up, invite our other panelists. If you guys want to turn your video off while the others are presenting, feel free, and then we can kind of have our presenter spotlighted as they go through today. So Jillian will just want to do that swap thing. Very cool. All right. Thanks, guys.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here this morning. So my portion of the panel is going to be talking about our response to COVID-19, specifically the Omicron variant. I know COVID has been a hot topic over the last couple of years. But I hope that some of the tools and strategic planning that I share with you this morning will be helpful, maybe even in the upcoming winter months, because once again, we're predicting not only a surge in COVID cases, but also the flu and RSV as well. So let's get started. So to give you a little bit of background, I started working for the Bettendorf Library in the end of March 2021. So we were about a year or change into the pandemic. Vaccines were just becoming widely available to the general public. As you can see in the chart that I'm sharing here with you today, this is our weekly reported cases for the Davenport-Bettendorf metro area, which certainly reflected a lot of the trends that we were seeing nationally, where COVID cases started to tail off that spring and summer. And then by the time fall started rolling around, we started watching those numbers steadily climb. When the Omicron popped up globally in late November, we knew it was only a matter of time before it started showing up stateside. And health organizations were starting to forecast a significant surge once again in COVID cases. So as I'm sure you all remember, at this point, there was a great amount of COVID fatigue. People were just tired of dealing with the pandemic. They wanted to spend the holidays with their friends and family. We knew that this wave of COVID was going to be a little trickier to manage the second time around, just because it had become a very polarized polarizing topic, and for us to revert back to a lot of our original COVID protocols that we had established at the beginning of the pandemic was going to be really difficult to navigate in kind of this politically charged environment. And I'm not specifically talking just about Bettendorf. It was obviously a very widespread issue across the state and the rest of the country. So but on the flip side, we also knew a lot more about COVID and how it's transmitted. So we were able to use that to our advantage as we were trying to develop a plan on how we were going to kind of get through this next wave. So when I got together with my library management team, we decided that our #1 goal was to keep the library staff as safe and healthy as possible, while also maintaining community access to the facility. We heard loud and clear from our community. They did not want us to revert back to express services. They were excited that the facility was back and open to the public, and they wanted us to maintain that. So as we were developing our plan, we really put an emphasis on focusing on customer and frontline services, as well as providing access to information through our physical and digital collections. And that emphasis kind of drove the rest of our plan. So first things that we looked at was, how are we going to keep staff safe? So we knew masks were the most effective way to help prevent the transmission of COVID. So we had a mask mandate for all library employees. This was actually a mandate across the entire city of Bettendorf. We really appreciated the support that we had from our city to maintain this for our staff. And then we highly encouraged library users coming into the facility to use masks. So we had friendly signs everywhere that said, you know, let's keep our community safe. We had masks right at the front of entrance of the facility at our various service points. We had antibacterial wipes and hand sanitizer available throughout the facility as well, and encouraged library users to take advantage of those things. We also looked at our programming, and we didn't want to outright cancel all of our programs because we knew that people were really wanting that face-to-face interaction that they had been missing for the last 1.5 years. So we identified programs that we felt we could provide in a safe environment. So things like our book clubs, where we could promote both hybrid, you know, that hybrid model of remote and in-person. We also evaluated our physical programming space. We're very fortunate in Bettendorf that our largest programming room, which is a large room that could be divisible into 3 different sections, has very high ceilings. So we knew it was great for like things like air circulation and whatnot. So if we typically reserved one of those sections for a library program, we would, during the months of January and February, instead expand it to the 2 sections of that meeting room to help promote social distancing. We also coordinated with the city of Bettendorf to provide free COVID tests and masks for our library staff, which we were very much appreciative of. They took that out of their budget, so we didn't have to pay for those things for PPE for staff, but any PPE that we offered to the community came out of our budget, and we felt that that was an easy, equitable way to kind of manage those costs. And then finally, we also created a staffing and service plan to help prepare for the possibility of multiple absences, which I'll show you in the next slide. So this is a very watered down version of our service plan, but what we did is we broke down what is the absolute bare minimum of staff needed to run the library safely and efficiently on a 4-hour block. So we do our schedules on 2- and 4-hour blocks. So we looked at that, and then also looked at what is the maximum workload that those individuals can manage during that 4-hour shift. And once we broke it down from there, we started building backwards. So what could we continue to add on based on our staffing levels if we had more people in the facility to the point where we got back to fully staffed again? Things that we specifically looked at were our hours. What could we maintain? We were open 9 to 9, Monday through Thursday. So those are obviously the longest days. So those would be the days that we would reduce if needed. We looked at what point do we limit programming capacity, and then what point do we outright cancel everything? What point do we reduce some of our service areas? What are the ones that are absolutely crucial to make sure that we have staffed? And then what are some that maybe we close down for a portion of the day and point them elsewhere? And then what point do we also start doing our hybrid work from home and in office protocols? And what point do we put staff working completely remotely? So one thing I will point out is we had staffing levels and response levels based on the CDC risk levels. So they had a color coordinated system based on the severity of cases within each community. I originally envisioned this being kind of an either or, so based on how many absences we have or the response level in the community. But we quickly abandoned that metric just because we immediately went into severe burgundy, like right out of the gate. So we knew that closing the facility to the public when we had 95% of the staff available to work, it was not going to be a popular decision. So we use that more as an internal metric instead. So we would tell staff, the staff are at an orange level, and that seemed to really resonate with our staff members. So communication was also very important during this time. So this is a sample of an email that I would send out to the staff on a daily basis, usually around noon. That's about the time that we knew whether or not we would have full staffing for the day or in the later evening hours. And also, as you can see, we share a lot of employees. So there's a lot of cross training going on. So we wanted to make sure that we were sharing, okay, if maybe tech services is down a few people, we know that new materials aren't going to go on the shelves as quickly as they normally do this week. Or, hey, circulation is really hurting. They have a couple people who are out. We want to send some people over to that division to help make sure that we're processing materials and getting things back out on the floor, so we can kind of help each other and just have a better picture of what our absences look like out. Full picture. At this point, you can see too that there was recommendation from the CDC that if you were exposed to COVID, that you would have to isolate and be in quarantine for X amount of time. So we made sure that we tracked our isolation versus our positive cases. And then finally, as just some recommendations, which I'm sure will be kind of a theme throughout today's webinar, as you're going around and planning some of these things, just be ready to be as flexible as possible and be ready to pivot. As I said earlier, we had a specific idea on how our service level plan was going to work, and we quickly kind of adjusted as needed when we were in the moment. Listen to your staff, listen to the feedback that they give you. We had some great participation from our frontline staff who were able to help us streamline a few things and change things on the fly, which I very much appreciate their willingness to share those things with me. Focus on the variables you can control. Obviously, when you're working with the public, you can come up with all sorts of different scenarios and a plan for each of those scenarios, and you can have someone walk through your front door and blow up that plan, or you just not have an idea of just something you didn't imagine. So just focus on things, again, that you can control. You can control staffing, you can control your services, you can control your facility, and build around those. Think about clear messaging to the public. We found that focusing on safety and statistics was the best route to go. I have a sample of one of the posters that we put up around the facility. It was this nice, feel good, we're all in it together. Let's focus and try and keep our community healthy. And that resonated with some people, but unfortunately, as we all know, COVID brought in some kind of individual, focus on the individual, focus on what about me, what about my needs. So we found that if we told staff, or staff told patrons, look, we have X amount of people to work the facility. If that number decreases, we'll have to go back to express services. And this is why we're taking these precautions. We'd see a little light bulb go off, and then we would find that people would kind of be a little kinder to us. So, and then finally, above everything, just remember to be kind to yourself. This was the last few years have been really hard, especially navigating through some uncharted waters. Put your mask on first before you start taking care of everybody else. Because if you start showing that stress or that frustration that can trickle down really quickly to your front lines, and you don't want that, obviously. But and just know that, you know, hindsight's 2020. You can have a plan, go into it, and decide to abandon it, and that's okay. You just kind of have to do what's right in the moment too. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. That's, I think, exactly what we were kind of hoping to do. I really like the focus on the staffing and the metrics. I think that was something that a lot of people tried to put into their plan in the beginning was, you know, when this happens, this is what our reaction is going to be. And so having that sort of proactively, I think, was really helpful. And we are up next with Bill. So if he's getting ready at this point, I will wait until he's got his screen up there and shared.
I have nothing to share. Slide.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Then I'm not going to wait anymore. Take it away, Bill. Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Carroll. I'm the director of the Marion Public Library. I've been here in Marion for about 1.5 years now. Prior to that, I was in Dubuque. I am going to talk to you about the 2020 derecho that had a significant impact on the Marion Public Library. I was not here for that event. I was still in Dubuque at the time, but that storm that came through in August 2020 significantly damaged the library building here in Marion to the point where the building became inoperable, and the collection and staff had to move out of the building. The derecho incident was a community-wide event. It was not just a library event. So the entire community lost upwards of 50% of the tree canopy, resulting in power outages, blockages, transportation issues, communication issues. So from the perspective of our library going through a disaster, it was more than just a library disaster. It was a community-wide disaster. Like I say, the library building was damaged beyond repair. The roof had multiple holes that were blown into it by the derecho. We lost upwards of 20% of our collection due to water damage and rain that got in after the holes that were put into the roof. So that was the disaster component. Because I wasn't here, I had to solicit information from my staff that survived that incident. And I've come to learn that there was not a strong plan in place for disasters for our library and a rudimentary plan for our overall city organization, for our community, for that type of disaster. So that right there was a learning opportunity when I came in after the disaster, which I'll come back to here in a couple minutes. Shortly after the derecho blew through, our staff didn't have a place to work. There were no reliable places in our community for people to obtain information. So temporary locations were set up for our city command team as well as the library team. The library team became the focal point for all information for inbound calls for our community. We set up within a couple days after the disaster technologies, mobile hotspots, and computers for the public to access, to give them access to the outside world. So one of the things I want to emphasize is that when you are all coming up with your disaster plan for your organization, keep in mind that flexibility is going to be a really powerful tool for you all. I know that Jillian mentioned the flexibility, and I can't emphasize it enough. Library staff here after the disaster were taking phone calls, being points of access throughout the community, literally with setting up tables at parks to give out information for people. They were some staff were directing traffic. So be flexible, know that much like our organization, your libraries are probably very held in high esteem in your communities. People rely on libraries for accurate information. So do understand that your community is going to look to you. So have some sort of plan if a disaster comes through for you to be able to be that source of information. Getting back to Marion. One of the other things that we now realize we were dealing with at the time of our disaster and didn't have a plan for was the actual impact on our staff. Because this was a community-wide event, we had several staff members that were personally impacted by the derecho. One of our staff members had her house lifted up off the foundation and deposited someplace else. So she was not only going through a trauma at work, she was going through a trauma in her own personal life. And that was not an uncommon story for other library staff members as well as city staff members. So keep in mind that flexibility again. When you're coming up with your plan, know that your people are going to have issues too sometimes during these disasters. So keep that in mind when you're coming up with your plan. I keep looking away because I'm looking at my notes on the side here that I have. What did we learn from that disaster? So I can't go to a city leadership meeting without hearing the word derecho at least once during the course of a meeting. Our community is still recovering, not recovering in the sense that we're cleaning up trees or we're rebuilding buildings. We're cleaning up in the sense of finances now. We're dealing with FEMA. We're dealing with long-term financial impacts that storm had on our community and our library. So that's another thing you want to keep in mind for your long-term plan for disaster recovery. Other things that we've learned from that particular disaster is the importance of having the plan. So our city has bolstered up its plan for disaster preparedness. Our organization, our library, has come up with several different plans for everyday types of emergencies and disasters, things like fire drills, tornadoes, things that you're all familiar with. But we've added new things. We have a COOP plan, a continuity of operations plan. So it's a specific detailed plan in the event of an emergency or disaster, who's in charge of the library, how they can be contacted. If the first person can't be contacted, who's next on that list? So that COOP plan is not only on file at the library, it's on file with our emergency services, with our city and our county. We are now, a year and a half later, at the point where we are developing a greater partnership plan with our city departments on what a potential next community-wide disaster looks like. So that's a work in progress for us. So there were a lot of things that we learned from the disaster. We got through it. We were very flexible. We dealt with things as they came, but not having that plan, I think, kind of threw things into chaos for the first couple days following that disaster. People in the city organization and library staff didn't know what to do or who to talk to. So having that continuity of operations, having that framework of a plan, even if a disaster happens and it's not quite what you planned for, you have some guidelines as to what your organization can do to move forward. The last thing I want to talk about was, because our library was destroyed, there were plans prior to that disaster for a new library to be built here in Marion. Those plans accelerated a little bit, and we were fortunate that we had secured the financing from the city to open a new library building. So long story short, although our old building was damaged beyond repair, we did recently open in our new building and are back up to full operations. So that is what I wanted to share with you all. Like I said, I wasn't here for the initial disaster and the planning. I had to seek out that information. But knowing that the organization and community went through that disaster was really helpful for us for planning into the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And I can't wait to come and see that new building. I'm glad it was in the works prior to the derecho, because otherwise it's like, oh, that sounds really bad that we only got a new building because the old one was destroyed. I think we're probably sensing a theme here. Both Jillian and Bill so far have talked about being proactive and having those things in place and remaining flexible. So I think that's going to be something we'll probably hear a little bit about as we move forward. So up next is Susie from Clinton.
Okay, thank you very much.
And Susie will want to do the swap presenter and slideshow thing here too. There we go.
Okay, so I am Susan Mesecher, and I am in the Clinton, Iowa area. In 2018, I worked for the Butte County Library in California. And I was the assistant director for our county library system. We had 6 locations. In 2018, on November 8th, we had the campfire start, which again, Paradise is north of Sacramento, so about an hour and a half north, right in the foothills. And at the time, I was the assistant director, and the county did have a somewhat disaster plan that was sort of thrown out the window. It basically destroyed the town of Paradise and some neighboring towns in a matter of hours. So the first thing we had to do was try to get a hold of our staff. And so it was hard because communication was eliminated, basically. So we had lost all communication except some cell phone service. So I had spoken to some staff members that were on the ridge trying to evacuate and not being able to contact them for 7 hours after. So the slide here, that's a picture I took in Chico, which you look like the fire is in Chico. It is not. This is the fire smoke coming into Chico from Paradise. And the text messages we first started receiving from the county at 8:34 a.m. about the fire approaching the Paradise community. I've also included some really good links for lessons learned from this fire. So if you want more information, the leaders from Butte County have those. I put those links on this slide. So we didn't really have a specific plan for the library. We had, all managers had FEMA training. We had a year before this happened. We were in the national news for the Oroville Dam spillway failure. And so we had evacuations of over 100,000 people trying to leave the area due to the Oroville Dam potentially being a failure. So we sort of talked about, as Butte County managers, we all would be activated in any kind of disaster. And then the town of Paradise had an evacuation plan, but there was only 3 roads down and 1 road north. So knowing where the Paradise Library was and our staff and where they could evacuate to in a disaster. So we were told at first that the Paradise Library burned. And so we didn't learn until November 12th that the library actually did survive. And so one of the things we had to do with the staff was decide, helping people figure out, was their place destroyed? And so we had a lot of people coming into the other locations and asking. And so the CAL FIRE had a nice resource that would show if a structure was damaged or destroyed or still there. And so that's how we learned that the Paradise Library did not burn in the fire. So we were very thankful for that. And the pictures, when we first were able to go inside the library and assess how we could reopen the branch after there was smoke damage and obviously no power for several months. One of the great things that we did discover was IT Disaster Resource Center. So they sent us technology. So we were able to get a fax scanner, printer, a telephone set up, and laptops and different things. So we were really fortunate that we were able to get those resources. It did take a long time for our library to reopen. During that time, though, we were offering at all of our locations free photocopying, faxing, scanning, any type of thing we'd normally charge for. Fines, we didn't charge fines for any books because all of our 6 locations and all of our patrons were affected by this fire. So we wanted to make sure that everybody had the resources that they needed. So one of the things that I like to mention, what Bill mentioned as well, is your staff. We did not know how far-reaching this was going to be for our staff. And so 9 of our staff members lost everything. And so dealing with that mentorship and supporting them and giving them the time to come in and talk to me and grieve and work through what they were going to do next wasn't something that I think was in anybody's plans on how to deal with a major disaster. And this kind of disaster, I kind of look at it as like a large scale tornado, basically, that destroyed, most of the town. So we did have a resource center. And I just want to say that Paradise was about 27,000 people, a little bit bigger than Clinton. Now they're down to about 2,000 or 3,000 people. So we weren't able to open the library in Paradise. We were open 6 days a week, including Sunday. We were open Tuesday through Sunday. And the Paradise Library reopened only 3 days a week at part-time staff. So it was a real hard shock for staff to know that worked there full-time, that their job was not going to be there every day anymore. So dealing with that with staff. So we had, we didn't have specific plans, but we did try to assemble a team. And I know in our disaster plan, we talked about the team. So the team at first consisted of our Chico branch manager, myself as the assistant director and our director, and also our literacy coordinator. And so, and the Paradise branch manager, which was very difficult because she had lost her home and she had just moved to Paradise and just bought a brand new home. So having to communicate with her and be delicate with the situation. Each person was responsible for different tasks, so no one felt too overwhelmed on the team. But it would have been great to know ahead of time, who our team was going to be. We just kind of made it on the fly. So we made good lists every week of what needed to be done, and who was going to take responsibility for what, and who needed help with what they were working on. And I just, again, stress that be prepared that a member of your team might be affected by the disaster and will not be able to work or will want to relocate during the recovery process. So again, we had 5 other locations, so we were able to shift staff around, but we were also activated as part of the disaster recovery. So a large number of county employees were also affected. And so it was hard to cover everything that needed to be covered. So keeping our 6 locations open, and then also having to go out and deliver food to the shelter workers, or work at a shelter, or work at the disaster recovery center. So those things were something that we had to schedule with all of our staff. And we also had staff who didn't want to work at the disaster recovery center. We had a table with books, and all we did was provide hugs and books. That was our main mission, where every other table at the disaster recovery center, they had to recover their documents that they had lost in the fire, apply for assistance. And so it was really stressful. So we wanted our table for the library to just be about books and hugs and sharing stories and listening to the people. So that was our huge contribution that we made for the community. And so basically, I think one of the things was trying to find our staff during the fire, but also, we didn't have any internet. The fiber line was burned. We didn't have email. Thank goodness we didn't have internet phones yet, because we still had landline phones. So a lot of those still worked in the county. So that helped us with communication. But here in Clinton, we use Sling, which is getsling.com. It's a communication and shift scheduling tool. And the basic version is free. So I really encourage that, because during the pandemic, during the pandemic and then during the derecho, we were able to communicate with our staff, because everybody that's a staff member has the app on their phone. And so it was easy for us to communicate that way. And speaking of derecho, this is a picture of my truck under a tree that fell during the derecho. Again, this was another thing that affected Clinton a lot. We lost power in one of our branches, the Lions branch, for a week. Here at the Carnegie Library, we did not lose power. And so everyone showed up, and it was during the pandemic. So I was at home with COVID. So I was trying to direct staff on making every table and every outlet available for people to plug in. Hy-Vee across the street was out of power and on a generator for a week. So we were really lucky to have power in our main building and being able to accommodate all those people. Also, I learned in the derecho that the county and the city and Mercy One had, and the emergency management here in Clinton had a mobile vehicle, and it had power and different resources for people to be able to use. And so this was parked by Central Fire Station in Clinton across in the parking lot. And so this provided a lot of resources. And I think, knowing what is out there in your community that you can share with the public, like, hey, this is out there, you can utilize the service, and just sharing that information. I think the biggest thing is just being there for the people and being able to help them get the resources they need, because I think a lot of people didn't know that the mobile community center existed. And so we didn't have Red Cross show up. This is what we had. So this was really helpful to learn that we have that as a resource.
Thank you, Susan. That was great. What I'm sort of hearing is we really have to be ready for those community-wide events. And it's not. There are times when it's just the library that gets hit by some kind of a disaster, but when it's the whole community, it really puts us in a completely different place in how we respond to those things. So Helen, as soon as you're ready, we'll let you get going here. Let's see, what else did I have on that one? Oh, looks like we're just about ready to go. Perfect. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, a little bit, my title slide is my disastrous life. I have gone through some major disasters and then a minor one, but never, it was a community-wide, the major one. Back in 2007, I was the director at the Coffeyville, Kansas Public Library. That was my hometown. It was a town of about, at that time, 12,000 people. But there were several days of record rainfall to the north of us, and the Verdigris River flooded on July 1st, and it took out a third of the city. It was a 20-foot wall of water that washed through the town. It rolled semis. It was a mess. But the library, fortunately, we weren't affected, though we did lose $50,000 in materials that people had checked out that were in the affected area. We were cut off totally because we were flooded on all sides for 3 days, helicopter access only. CNN and the Weather Channel, they hung out at the library a lot. We did work with the staff. We all worked together. I only had 6 staff counting me on how best the library could serve the community. The thing was, City Hall was, trying to put in a command center and things like that. And so then I approached them and they brought us in so I could attend the meetings. And so we could get the information out. There were so many rumors going around. I have a couple pictures to top off the 20-foot wall of water. The town up to the north of us accidentally dropped in a bunch of raw sewage, and then we have a refinery in Coffeyville, and they accidentally, again, released over 99,000 barrels of crude oil into the floodwater. So not only was it a flood, but it was a kind of a environmental disaster. This is our was the fairgrounds. As you can see, the water was very high. They had to rebuild all these buildings after this. This is a 3-story hotel here. You can see how high the water was. Most of this all had to be destroyed and rebuilt. It was a little bit of a boon to the citizens because this was not in a floodplain. Some of the houses a little bit closer to the refinery were, but the ones to the south were not. And with the released oil into the water, they were able to get the refinery had to buy out their property. So that did help a little bit, but there was over 1,000 houses had to be destroyed. So the whole east side of Coffeyville now really is basically a big green space. But in this picture, again, you can see the oil in the water. And then much like Katrina, they had to do search and rescue. The floodwaters did not recede for 9 days. So it was a mess when they went into these homes. Of course, it was July, Kansas, humid. There was like 6-foot-high mold spores, and bless their hearts, some people were trying to bring their library books back covered in mold, and we were like, no. But and we're like, we're not going to charge you. So, and then this was kind of one of the residential areas that was affected, and it was just a mess. But like I said, the library, we decided to work closely with the city's command center. When FEMA first got into town, I believe it was on the 4th day, they set up in the library. At the time, the library was the only place with public access computers. We, of course, back in 2007, there was not any hotspots or that we had, so we adjusted our hours. We extended our hours from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., especially because the largest shelter was like a block from the library. So those people could come in. We did reserve the computers, though, for FEMA use as they were trying to help people fill out their documentation, because they declared us a disaster zone. I think it was on day 5, maybe. Staff, we learned a lot about FEMA applications and things like that. But at least one staff attended each, command center meeting, but also community meeting and the press conference. So, and then we would post this accurate information for the people, and they would come to the library to read it. There were so many rumors and so much misinformation that was being spread that we thought that was one way that we could really help. We did, like I said, forgave over $50,000 in damaged and lost materials. And then after all of this kind of simmered down, I found an organization, and for the life of me, this is a long time ago, I cannot remember their name. They were a volunteer organization that would come in, they would take a high resolution picture of the damaged family photo, and then volunteers around the world would restore those photos and send them back to the people, and then they could come into the library to pick them up. It was really a neat thing. If I remember correctly, they did over 10,000 photos, something like that. But at the time, the library did not have a disaster plan of any sort. You'd think they would have, being in Tornado Alley, but we didn't. I did meet with the city government after this and made sure that we were included. We hadn't been on their disaster response, so the library would have a voice and a team in helping to get information out. I think that was our main thing to do. It was, of course, we were without water too for like 4 days until they finally got that straightened out. But we had porta potties and then bottled water. But it was, the library offered, and I think it was like Susan said, people were coming to check out books. But it was also a way for the people to get away from the shelter. There was like 3,000 people. I think there's 3 different shelters in town, and this one had over 1,000 people in it, and it was a mess. And people were so stressed and so anxious that they would come to the library, and at least it was semi calm after that. So that was a disaster that I would never want to go through again. FEMA was happy to share that the code name for our disaster was Little Katrina, because this was 2 years, and they said it was the same toxic soup that they saw when they worked the Katrina disaster. Okay, so here at Sioux City, I show up, and I've been here since 2017, and June 2020, before the derecho, but we had a water main break out in the street in front of the library. All of a sudden, water started bubbling up through the sewers. It was just, I mean, we couldn't control it. We were trying to keep it out. We were trying to sweep it, but and this is a picture a couple days later that's on the slide, but we had about 6 to 8 inches of sewer water, what they deemed black water, and on our whole lower level, which is the administration offices and the tech services department. And of course, it smelled bad because, again, sewage. So we had to have everything replaced, and all the carpet, the baseboards, the furniture that had been set in the water had to be discarded. We also had a storage area under our garage where we had some excess shelving and some furniture that we were going to maybe use in different arrangements, but that had to all be thrown out because it was contaminated. They had to make sure the moisture wasn't getting in the walls. Yeah, it was a mess, but luckily we weren't open to the public during this time. So we, kind of worked through it and got new carpet, and, we were happy that it didn't affect the collection. The children's area, they have a storage room down here, and they lost a lot of stuff that they had on the floor. Now we have pallets in there, so their stuff hopefully won't get destroyed. So, we thought that was bad. We got through it. Well, in May 2021, we had a second flood, the exact same thing, water main break. But this time, they were happy to report it was only brown water. It was only dirt in it. So we didn't have to pull up the new carpet. It affected all the same areas. This happened in the middle of the night. I showed up down here. It did flood our friends. We store our friends' donations in our basement garage area, and they did lose about 50 boxes of donated materials. I was down there by myself at, it was about 2 a.m, I guess. And it was kind of, I said, like watching the Titanic, as those boxes, they were in cardboard, was just absorbing the water and then toppling over. But anyhow, that was another mess. But they had to drill holes up in the walls because this time moisture did get up in the walls more. But again, we replaced the baseboards, as you can see here. But the carpet was salvageable. So we we cleaned it up. They did a deep clean and then tried to dry it out. These were huge fans. It sounded like working in an airport. So that went on for about 2 weeks until they got the moisture level down. We also had huge humidifiers. You can see this yellow tub up here. That was, they would drain. There's a hose that would drain, that pull out the moisture out of the air. We have a disaster plan here at Sioux City, but it doesn't deal with flooding because we are far enough away from the river that we thought this wouldn't affect us. But it did. So, but you might think, well, 2 water main breaks. No. Oh, there's just what happened. The holes drilled. But our third water main break happened this year, June. Luckily, we didn't get as much damage. Not as much water came into the actual building. The problem with this water main break, it's the same one. This one dislodged a whole bunch of cast iron into our plumbing system. We had been without water, and the city tried to route around our filter so we could get water, because it was summer reading. We had porta potties and toilets outside, and there was some disgruntled parents, which I understood, but we didn't have any choice. It was at our close. And we also supplied bottled water for people. But when they routed around it, it just plugged everything up. I mean, all the toilets, all the sinks, all the faucets. I mean, it was a mess. It took about over a month to finally get all the problems with the plumbing situated. They had to replace all the flushometers. It messed up the seals, all the faucets. So, once again, this wasn't in any of our plans, and luckily we could operate at the other two branches. Well, the first flood in 20, we were closed, but we didn't open until July, reopen. But these other two, it didn't affect necessarily our day-to-day operations. So we were fortunate in that aspect. COVID, I think we all dealt with that, but we were lucky. The city did close all city buildings on March 17th, but we were able to keep all the library staff here working. I worked with a supervisor to perform a major weeding project. The city had a work from home policy, but it didn't affect my staff because, public service staff on the desks, they don't necessarily, there's only so much training you could do from home. And then I had several staff that do not have computers or internet at home. So I did work with the city and then my supervisors so we could keep them all working. And then the supervisors also developed a grid to keep the staff separated while they were working on this big project. In January of 2020 we had started our new strategic plan, and we had one of the things on there was a major weeding shifting project that was going to be completed over 3 years. Well, we got to do it in 2 months and it was all done. So anyhow, then we also, our other staff, our reference staff, relocated from their cubes to various spaces throughout the library to help reduce the spread. We developed a curbside pickup service at our smallest branch. And then we also removed all the tables and chairs from the break rooms to help to reduce the spread as well. We got new cleaning schedules. We, every hour would wipe down surfaces once we reopened. We also had a new spray sanitizer that we used in public spaces. And then, like I said, in July of 2020, we reopened at the Morningside branch, but we were still quarantining returned items, and then reopened by appointment down here at the downtown and fully reopened in May of 21. It's funny, we are still dealing with sporadic cases in staff. It seems to go through the staff in, kind of chunks and with no rhyme or reason. It's not like staff that work together, but it just seems like, 2 or 3 will get it all at once. But here is Sioux City. Like I said, we have a disaster plan, but I think the most important part that is helpful for us is the summary of procedures. And this kind of works for everything. It, it has the how to assess it, set up a command post if needed, which we did during the first major flood. I assigned the team leaders and responsibilities. We set the priorities for salvage. Gather support volunteers. We did not have to do that because there was a restoration company that came in and cleaned out all the debris. So this was one of the things that we found most useful that helped. It gives a clear line of procedures and the processes that you need to go through. The other part of our disaster plan has a current list of all our vendors, companies that could help, like with carpet cleaning or restoration services, things like that. That's very helpful as well. The other part of our disaster plan is about how to recover books and things that are damaged by water, especially because we do have a huge sprinkler system in the library. And I think that really needs to be updated and moved. And I do have that on my list of things to do. But that's kind of my disastrous life in a nutshell. You know, I've been fortunate. It's nothing major that hit my specific library, but I think the best piece was that community involvement that happens, and make sure that the city is aware of the library and what we can offer to the people that are affected. So, yeah, that's it for me.
All right. Thank you very much, Helen. So Dara, if you are getting ready to get queued up here, again, I think that idea of communication is important. We sort of heard that throughout all of this. And seriously, Helen, you have dealt with absolutely everything. I wish you peace for the next several years. No more disasters in Sioux City. I think it's been well enough. You've had to deal with enough of those things there. So let's see, Helen, do we need to have you stop sharing?
Yep,
Sam,
that's what it's telling me.
Great. Perfect. Thanks, Dara.
Yep. And I think
we'll get you going and up here.
Dara, it should all be about me anyhow. You can talk about mine.
Well, you know, Helen, it was very like you got a lot, right? There's a lot going on. Are you guys seeing the full slide, or are you seeing the presenter view, just to make sure?
We're on the full slide. It's perfect. Thanks.
Okay. So hi, I'm Dara Schmidt from the Cedar Rapids Public Library, and I'm not going to tell you a lot that everybody kind of hasn't already said. Like Bill, I came after one of Cedar Rapids' largest disasters. And so this is the 1985 library. And then in 2008, this is what the 1985 library looked like. It was under ever so much water, and it became the largest library disaster in United States history at that time. I think worse things have happened now, and I think Darryl might be telling you about some of them in a little bit, but what was really important about this is there was a plan, but the gauges higher up in the river failed, and so no one in Cedar Rapids understood just how catastrophic the flood was going to be. And so though there was a plan, the plan completely and totally failed, not just for the library, but for everybody else in the community. Over 200,000 volumes were lost, let alone the equipment, the furniture, the fixtures. Like basically the library was deemed a total loss by FEMA. And what's really important about this is the Cedar Rapids Public Library in 2008 became the first library that FEMA recognized as an essential service. And so now after Cedar Rapids, if major disasters happen and there is 51% or more of damage to a building, FEMA will cover the cost of replacement of a public library, but that did not happen before Cedar Rapids. And so you're welcome. So proud we could be that for everybody. So then I came to Cedar Rapids in 2014, and just like Bill was mentioning, in Marion, when I came to Cedar Rapids, everybody was still talking about the flood because it affected everybody in the community. Like Susan was talking about, like, you know, these major disasters that affect everybody, like there was still a lot of trauma response happening from staff, and everybody was telling their personal 2008 flood stories. And in what they were saying is, we just didn't know what to do. Like we had a plan, but we didn't feel like we knew what to do. Maybe the managers knew. There actually wasn't a library director at the time the flood happened, which was part of the problem with the response too. But people really didn't feel like they had a solid plan. And so that was one of the first things that I undertook as a director, is to start disaster preparedness planning for Cedar Rapids. And like a good librarian, I went and found plans from my peers across Iowa and across the country and copied what they did, found good ones, borrowed as we do. And when the 2016 flood hit, when I was in Cedar Rapids, we were able to have a really coordinated response. The library was in the flood inundation zone. And so the city at that point made a decision to cordon off downtown because everybody was really burned from 2008, and they wanted to make sure that the community was as safe as they could possibly be. Even the best laid plans, the city activated all city directors as essential services because that's how it's defined by FEMA. And once you've had FEMA dollars and go through a FEMA disaster, you have to do FEMA training every year. And it is exhausting and interesting, but we're tapped as essential services. And so that means that, you know, the library director is sitting at the table with public works and people who are having to do, I would say, a different level of response than I had to do. But it was great to be in those rooms and understand. And so, you know, they were showing us on the maps where they were going to draw the lines for the cordoning off of the city. And the library was considered an incredible community resource. And so they wanted to make sure that the library could still be open. And we went back and forth on it a little bit, and they showed me where the lines were. And then 2 minutes after the meeting, the chief of police was the one who was speaking at the press conference. And he said in the press conference, and we're closing the library because we want everyone to be safe. We don't want to encourage people to come downtown. And it was like, oh, well, I guess that plan has changed. And so the library was closed, but you can see here from this picture, like we knew what the predicted flood levels were going to be. We have planning that shows exactly what our response needs to be based on the predicted flood level. And then we went up one more just to be safe. The library that I'm in right now is built up. Additional earth was added. And so it is already 3 feet above the 2008 floodplain and is moved back from the river. But even though it was not predicted that water would come into the library, we still moved furniture. We moved books up from the bottom shelf, moved some of the tech to be safe. So that flood plan that we had really clearly identified who was responsible for what and how that was going to play out. And so communication happens from our community relations manager. Building closure happens because the city manager tells us, or the city tells us, like, we don't get to decide when they're drawing those maps, as was clearly illustrated in the press conference. Service disruptions, we don't have a separate facilities department. We're part of our city facilities. And so they're letting us know about those. And then what staff was going to do. And we wanted to make sure, first and foremost, that we value staff safety and their emotional well-being. And we don't know, we have a large staff between our 2 locations. We've got 84 people who work for the library, and I know all of them. I know all of them by name, but I don't know where they all live. I don't know what their situation is. And so if they're in a flood zone or if they've got a concern, like, we want to make sure that they had the ability to take their flex to get out, to take care of their homes. And those of us who lived on top of hills or in safe places could handle the library. And so that was really important to communicate to staff in the planning stages before the disaster actually hit. Everything spelled out. And then when we got to evacuation, that our materials manager directed the evacuation procedures, but we had to prioritize everything in order, right? The books needed to be pulled off. We had exactly the number of carts. We knew where things were going to go. And then if you look at the bottom of this page, it's too many words, don't read the whole thing, but basically, like, all of our programming team, like, the garage is lower than the storage closet in the programming space. And so you got to prioritize, like, physically where things are in the building to make sure that everybody's getting what they need. And then obviously after that, we decided to be really good, and we had plans for everything we could possibly have plans for. And then, the pandemic hit and we had no plans for that. And just like everybody else, Jillian gave you some great examples already. Like, look, the flexibility was so important doing the best we could with the information we had at the time. And then when information or knowledge changed, making changes and being flexible to make sure that we were as responsive to our community as possible. During all of those updates and iterations of plans, what really became important is having conversations with our trustees about what we were trying to do and why, and being a truly responsive community library. And that led us to change how we talk about our disaster responsiveness. And so we don't have a disaster plan now. We have what we call a service continuity plan, because no matter what's happening, we want to provide the library service we can. As a vibrant and heavily used community resource, the library is committed to serving our patrons whenever possible. And look, sometimes it's not possible. And those are the times that are few and far between, and we will deal with those. But in all of our scenarios, whether it's flood or wind or anything you can imagine, severe weather, like all of those, everything in our service continuity plan starts with like, we're gonna try and maintain whatever service we can. And then again, in unpredictable things that we just were not prepared for, the 2020 derecho. And this is just outside the downtown library. And you can see across the street in the top left corner of that picture, like those trees are not still standing. Cedar Rapids, right next door to Marion, actually took the brunt of the storm. We lost 70% of our tree canopy in less than 30 minutes. So 7 out of every 10 trees in our community were knocked down, and they were lying in the street. And you couldn't get places. Most people lost power for almost 2 weeks. People lost internet for far longer than that. In some cases, up to almost 3 months. People still didn't have home internet. Like it was, our communication systems were down. Like even there was barely any way to even communicate with each other. Cell phones didn't work. Nobody had power. It was something. And so as soon as we could get back in the library, we pulled the tables out. We had the charging stations because the downtown library got power back within 2 days, which was shocking because nobody else did. But like other people were saying, we have our greatest resource is our staff. They are amazing people who want to help. And that's what they do. And so as soon as the city set up these neighborhood resource centers, we deployed our staff wherever they were needed. And it was there is not a single person on our staff that was not affected in their home. Some had worse destruction than others. Up to 2 years afterwards, we still had staff who were displaced from their homes. That's how bad things were and how hard it was to get repairs in. But they wanted the relief from their own problems to be able to help others in need. And so deploying those staff to wherever was useful, they counted downed trees on trucks for FEMA. They went to these resource centers. And our greatest example of what the library means to our community and to public service is that our Ladd Library on the west side of town, our branch facility, it had damage to the roof. And so we couldn't open that until the engineers cleared that roof damage. And so the library was physically closed and nobody could come in the building. The staff spaces around the back were cleared because it wasn't where the damage was pretty early, so we could get staff in, but we couldn't let the public in. And within less than 8 hours of the storm coming through, people just started showing up in the library parking lot. They didn't know where to go. They didn't know what to do, but they knew the library would help them. And that is something that our staff take so deeply seriously and personally. And they wanted to make sure that we could do that no matter what. And so, that health, that mental well-being of your staff is important, but service can sometimes help that. But allowing that freedom for staff to make that choice and to cover whatever you can cover, I highly recommend. And then, just when you think you're done, A couple of months ago, we had a fire right in the center of our downtown library. It happened at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were about 200 people in the building when it happened. You can see this light fixture started to go, and then it was raining fire down on the people on the first floor. Staff did an amazing job because we have a plan and we practice our fire drills once a year, just like school. So we wanted to make that practice really did a great job at making sure we knew exactly what to do when a thing happened. And the fire department had arrived in less than 5 minutes while we were putting fire extinguishers to the flames, and we had patrons out in less than 4 minutes. And so everybody was safe, nobody got hurt. And you guys, oh, it's not the fire, it's the smoke. The smoke was god awful, and we have a large open building and it got everywhere. So we were closed for over a month because every single item and every single surface in our entire library had to be wiped down before we could be open to the public. So, you know, I don't really have anything other than what everybody else has said. Flexibility, you never know what's going to happen next, and being as flexible as possible and having as many meetings as you need to have, whether it's virtual or in person, just to make sure that especially your leadership is aligned, and then they can be communicating out to the rest of your staff. So that's what I have.
Thank you very much, Dara. Darryl, if you want to get your slides queued up and ready to go, we are going to be pressing right up against 11 o'clock. So what I'd like to propose is Darryl's getting his stuff ready here, that we do questions because we've been going for an hour and a half. If we want to stop by 11, if our presenters are amenable to that, you can contact them directly with questions. I think that might be a little bit easier. So Darryl, whenever you're ready.
Am I sharing my screen? I'm not sure.
Yes, please. Oh, no, we're not seeing it.
Okay. Let's see. I've lost everything all of a sudden here. That's just great.
Oh, that happens. Things get hidden behind other windows and then I can't find it.
I'm trying to find the share screen. There we go. Begging y'all's pardon. Does that look right, or do I need to?
We need to do the swap. Yep.
Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, well, listening to some of the other presentations, it occurred to me that my experience, am I sharing now?
Yes, you are. It's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. That my experience being a little older and further afield may have been, I think, some of the basis of what became some of the standard practice in libraries when it came to serving human populations in the wake of disasters. The experience that I had, my name is Darryl Eschete. Some of y'all know me. I'm the director of the Des Moines Public Library, but my experience was based in the post-Katrina era, down in Terrebonne Parish, where I'm originally from. And what ended up happening in our experience was that, to make clear, as you can see in this slide, I'm from Houma, and Houma is about 50 miles from New Orleans. And at the end of August of 2005, as those of you old enough to remember, Katrina came ashore between Louisiana and Mississippi and pushed a bunch of water up the canal into behind the levees in New Orleans, and the levees broke. And of course, you can all recall the humanitarian disaster that was involved there, as tens and maybe even hundreds of thousands of people were flooded out of their home. Now, it had been, I think that it had been kind of a generational loss of memory before this happened. There hadn't been a disaster of this scope and size in the United States for a while before this happened. And so I think that there were response failures at absolutely every level on the ground in New Orleans. And so what ended up happening was there was a couple days of delay And the reason that I think that these maps are important is because Homa ended up being on what we call the good side of the storm, which is where the spin of the storm was pushing the water out of Terrebonne Bay and away from Homa. Homa, my hometown, is below sea level, but we didn't ended up getting any flooding, and we really didn't get that much wind damage. So when it started to become apparent that people were going to be displaced out of the city of New Orleans, as you can see there from that map, Homa became one of the first places where evacuees landed. Some of them went north to Baton Rouge. Some of them, they couldn't really go east because that part of Mississippi was having its own troubles. I think, as I recall correctly, Waveland and Diamond Head were just about wiped out. So they all had to come to the west. And one of the first stops, as you see there, is Homa. What made our experience as a library unique, as you can see from this slide, the Terrebonne Parish Library main branch, where I was the head of reference at the time, is a mere less than 500 feet from the Barry P. Bonvillain Civic Center, which, as you can see in the picture on the right, in the first week, I think there were 300 or 400 evacuees, and over the course of the month of September, coming in several waves, as they would sort of park people there, and the goal was to move them along to other places. A lot of them ended up in Houston, and some of them ended up very far afield, even as far, there was some, I met somebody in downtown Iowa within the last 10 years who had been kicked out of New Orleans because of the storm. But the point being that what made our experience unique was the proximity of the library to a shelter, and the number of people that were in it. And also, we ended up being leaned upon because what was happening was the response was just not there. I think that several days went by before the first representative of FEMA ended up there, and we ended up having to learn the ins and outs of the disaster relief application system. The FEMA servers were going up and down probably every hour and a half or so. So what ended up happening was staff had to learn how to help people put in their own applications. Thus the title of this presentation, which I'm going to get to. So the situational facts were that 5,000 people of all ages and background came in several waves over the course of a month, and they were 500 feet from the library. And anybody who's ever been in a post-storm sheltering situation knows how uncomfortable and how boring and how scary that situation can be. There's that there on the right is a picture that was taken inside the Barry P. Bonvillain evacuation center, the Civic Center. The people that we saw over the course of that month, probably 70% or more of them, they were coming out of the lower 9th Ward in New Orleans, the 5th Ward, some of the places against the 17th Street Canal, some of the worst hit places. Some of them had lost absolutely everything. There were no baby pictures for these people to have recovered. They had no cars, they had no money. Some of them were wearing borrowed clothes. Federal and state agencies were completely overwhelmed. Some of them were missing family members and were trying to find them. Some of them had limited technological proficiency and literacy, thus the title of this. I titled it that because in the course of our helping people with their FEMA applications, I went into the computer lab and was leaning over somebody's shoulder and basically pointing out to the screen and saying, as you see here, you have to fill this out. As you see here, you have to click this. And I went back to the desk, and this was an elderly lady who was there with her son. And her son came to the desk and said to me, hey, we might need some more help because, you know, my mama doesn't read, bruh. So we ended up having to sit there and help a lot of these people go through the full application process. And of course, they were dealing with extreme stress, trauma, and boredom of the shelter thing. Some of these people who came into the library said, I was on a roof in the CBD just 5 hours ago, and here I am in the sticks. In the interest of respecting everybody's time, because I know that we're running a little long, there were several takeaways that got worked into the future disaster planning for the Terrebonne Parish Library. One, and I think are good general rules of thumb for libraries generally. One, that libraries have to be situationally aware organizations. They have to keep up with the weather alerts, the news alerts, and they need to cultivate those partnerships. For instance, the West Des Moines Public Library, and I believe that probably most libraries in Polk County are on the listserv or information feeding list of, say, Polk County Emergency Management. They let us know when there's going to be a heat wave. They let us know when there's going to be some sort of weather event. That was something that was not the norm in 2005 and 2006. Libraries were something of an afterthought in terms of disaster response that early. The second thing I think is that staff has to be prepared as thoroughly as possible. We in HOMA, being on the quote unquote good side of the storm, when all of this started happening, it was kind of a surprise to us in a certain way, because I don't think that we could have foreseen that we would have ended up being the public library for 5,000 people who were from out of town. So we, having gotten a little bit of warning, or our library director, Mary Cosper LaBeouf, having gotten more warning probably would have been useful. But as I say, back then, the library just by accident ended up being a spot where there was a whole large degree of human service that was necessary to these poor people who were evacuated. Another thing that I think that we learned is that even though disasters don't discriminate, resilience and recovery ability certainly does. There's a lot of assumptions I think people would make now more than they did then. Everybody's got a cell phone, everybody's got an ID on them. I can tell you, when you end up having to bust through your roof to get pulled out of there by a helicopter, that IDs, cell phones, et cetera, get left behind. So I think there's a lot of assumptions that have to be adjusted to almost zero if you're going to serve people who are dealing with in the wake of a disaster. And so what we ended up being told was just relax into the rule breaking. Let them eat and call their people if they can. Don't try to enforce all the rules, because you're just going to cause conflict. And I think that was one of the most useful takeaways, which was that being a rock rib fundamentalist about library rules was not going to serve anybody much. One thing that we developed and that I would advise would be to develop some sort of disaster wiki in advance. No local aid agency contacts, your health units, the Red Cross, the local churches, because a lot of them are going to be getting donations from all over the place that they're going to be trying to funnel to people. Knowing where they are and knowing what they're doing is very useful information. Some other information that's useful is your major insurance company contacts in your community. That should be part of your public service plan. One thing that we learned was local bank contacts, ATM locations, maps of ATM locations, and the routing numbers of banks. Back then, the way it worked when you filled out your FEMA application was they were able to wire money directly into your account if you had the routing number. And as I say, a lot of these people didn't have that, and having a list of the routing numbers and the local banks ended up being very useful. And as I said a moment ago, making sure that your library has a reliable contact with the regional emergency and disaster teams is very useful, because I think that as some of these stories you're hearing here today, libraries never know when they're going to end up staging areas. One thing that we certainly learned repeatedly is that the agencies in your community in the wake of a disaster are going to be changing where they are, changing what they do. So it's a good idea to have somebody maybe call around or be continuously updated, because sharing incorrect and outdated information equals frustration, and that equals conflict. And as the head of reference, I authorize staff to listen for and manage rumors, because one of the facts about being temporarily located in a shelter is that there's a magnified grapevine effect that happens in a shelter. So if one person hears something wrong, it spreads quickly. And in our case, it became difficult because we were talking, I think we were overheard talking about trying to get donations of long distance calling cards. And somebody interpreted that to mean that we already had them, and we had to manage that misinformation for a while, saying that we don't have those cards, but we're trying to set up a phone where people can do long distance calls or whatever. So listening for and managing rumors can be very important if you're going to keep people from being even more stressed out or having their life be even more difficult. Some other things that we learned, because there were only a limited number of computers and at times a seemingly unlimited number of people trying to use them, was creating some sort of communal space or a waiting room with media in the library where they could listen to the news or read newspapers or whatever, because what a lot of the reason that one of the biggest reasons that people were coming in the library was simply to get information about what was going on in Orleans and Jefferson Parish or whatever. So having some available news certainly made it easier for them to be waiting to use a computer. One thing that we did was adjust open hours and be willing to adjust overtime considerations, especially since every evening when at the normal closing time, there were a lot of people who'd been waiting for a while to use a computer and or whatever it is they were waiting with help with. And so there were times where we just kind of said, well, let's close the doors here, get through this crowd of people here, and then we'll close. So having that conversation with your administration, if you're dealing with a serious the aftermath of a serious disaster, can certainly be useful. Some other things, the adjustment of time limits up and down, or even the elimination of time limits, just to make sure that everybody gets everything done that they need to get done. Of course, a lot of this, I say, is framed in information from a long time ago, but I don't foresee a time when applying for disaster relief of any kind is not going to be at least partially online. So the availability of public computers and making sure that people have the time to use them thoroughly is important. I think also, as I said, regarding the rumor management, a library which can have a publicly accessible phone or phones with long distance access. You can't presume that people's cell phones survived or that they know where they are in the wake of something very serious. And that can be a great use to people, especially if they're trying to link back up with family members that they might not know where they are, even if they're still alive. Partnering with organizations that have therapeutic and counseling skills. We ended up working with a local church called Harvest Church, where they had some people on their staff who had therapeutic and counseling skills coming in and helping. That can be very much a part of that communal space and waiting room with media. Just having people there that they can talk to walk around and to talk to people who are in this sort of stressed out state, say, hey, there's somebody here who's looking out for you, who has the skills to talk to you and to listen for what you're going through. This is probably more important now even than it was then, but having partners with translation skills. For the most part, the people that we dealt with in the wake of Katrina were all English speakers, but as I recall, there were some people who had limited English skills. And so at least knowing who you can call in to have a conversation in Spanish or Portuguese or whatever language arises, or to have some sort of translation phone service like the city of West Des Moines has, and to know how to use it can be very important if you're going to end up dealing with people who are in this sort of humanitarian crisis. Another thing I think is that a general rule as a library director, I would say, is to make sure that your staff has at least some training in de-escalation skills, because even though for the most part, the people that we dealt with, that 5,000 or 6,000 people over that month who came in were very grateful and very cooperative. As I say, they were very stressed out, and sometimes there were misunderstandings, and it became necessary to sort of negotiate on the fly to keep people calm, and making sure that staff has at least some of those skills can be very useful. And one thing is our experience with FEMA in an article that I wrote for Louisiana libraries in the spring of 2006, I tried my best not to throw FEMA under the bus, but at that time, I think that FEMA wasn't sure where they should be going to find all these people. I think that as a library director or a library administrator, one thing to remind your local FEMA or your local federal contacts is to at least make the library part of the circuit that they're going to be riding, because that's something that at least back then, and I think as you can see the picture there, there's a FEMA worker visiting with somebody in the library. You want to make sure that FEMA understands that a lot of people who are in need, especially if they are evacuated or displaced, will end up in libraries. And you want to make sure to remind them, make sure to come in and check, or at least have your, make sure that your contact information is publicized. And I think that was probably one of the most important things, because as the month wore on, by the end of the month, FEMA had a permanent presence at the library. They were there when we opened, and they were there when we closed. They just stayed all day, and they were sort of playing the role of consultant to these people who'd been misplaced out of New Orleans and the environs around there. And that is pretty much all I would have to share. As I say, I know that the experience is sort of far afield, and it's not likely that a hurricane will come through central Iowa. But I think that the possibility, as Miss Helen's story told, and Miss Dara's story shows, a mass disaster can happen anywhere, no matter where you are, and that it very frequently lands in the public library. So I thank you very much, and that ends what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Darryl. That's exactly what I was trying to get with this. So I think you've summed up perfectly what we were trying to do with this workshop. I think ending with this was exactly right. You had lots of great practical examples for us and kind of took us full circle back. Let me go ahead and put that back on. Kind of took us full circle back. I really liked how you started out, talking about some of those failures in Katrina really have informed us, not just in the library field, but in disaster planning for the whole country. As we're getting ready to close out here, I just have a couple of things besides saying a huge thank you to all of our presenters. I'm really grateful that you guys were all here, and I loved all the different perspectives. A few of the takeaways that I heard kind of over and over, I want to just kind of sum up a couple of those, and then we'll let you all get on your merry way. Make sure the library is part of the city, county, FEMA team. I think that is something we heard over and over again. Have a plan. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of all this, but remember to keep it flexible. We definitely heard that over and over again as well. And I really like the idea of sort of the library as that trusted information source, whether it's stopping the rumors or just being the place to go. When you need answers during this disaster, the library is the place to be. Communication, several of you mentioned that as well, how important that is with each other, with your staff, with the city, with the other powers that be, as well as with the community. And that's kind of the place where I wanted to end. And I heard this so often, and it's something that I don't think many of us thought about until you've been through this, and that is, don't forget that effect of trauma on people. And some of us maybe have come across that a little bit more after COVID, but trauma on our community as a whole, and the trauma that we see within our staff, and make sure that we sort of respect and care for that as we're going through. So those are some of the takeaways that I got. I hope you guys all were able to get a lot of good information and insight from our 6 presenters. And I just want to say thank you so much. This sort of came together. I started talking about it a long time ago, and it never quite gelled in my head until last week. So I'm really grateful to our presenters. Thank you guys for pulling this all together. It was exactly what I had envisioned, and I hope everybody got a lot out of it.